Okay, we have a good crowd. I think we can start. Being very un-Brazilian, we'll be very punctual. So I'm Monica de Bol. I'm the director of the Latin American Studies program and the Emerging Market Specialization here at SAIS. And tonight's event is, as you know, about Bolsonaro's foreign policy. Before I get to that, let me just take the opportunity to welcome everyone who's here. I know that we had some threats of inclement weather, so I'm glad that all of you made it. I'd also like to extend a welcome to all those who can't be here, but who are with us via live stream and are watching our event. So on to the event. Usually when we have panels here at SAIS about Brazil, we tend to be more generalist and focus more on the political situation and the macroeconomic outlook. And we keep on, I have a sense that we keep on having more or less the same conversations over and over and over again. So Peter and I, because this event is co-organized with the Inter-American Dialogue, and we have been doing a series of Brazil events together, SAIS and the Dialogue, we had come up with the idea of having one event specifically focused on Brazilian foreign policy. It hasn't been something that we've done an entire event on because Brazilian foreign policy hasn't been all that eventful in the last few decades. However, this has now changed, or at least it seems to be changing. And this is why we've convened this very distinguished panel to talk about and have a conversation with you about what foreign policy is likely to be under Bolsonaro. As all of you know, Bolsonaro was elected last October as the president of Brazil. He has been in office for a little less than a month and a half now. He was inaugurated on January 1st. But there's been a lot of action on the foreign policy front. And so much so that last week we had here in DC a visit by the Minister of Foreign Relations. He was in town meeting with a number of administration officials and clearly sending out signals that Brazil wants greater proximity with the U.S. We will focus some of our remarks on that particular aspect of Brazilian foreign policy, which is markedly different from what we've seen or what we had seen in previous governments. But we will also take some time to talk about, the implications of the new Bolsonaro administration for what's currently going on in Venezuela, as well as use the opportunity to look at foreign policy and talk about Brazilian politics more generally. So with that, let me briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. They have very lengthy bios. I'm not going to read out their very lengthy bios, and they will all excuse me for that. So we have Mr. Peter Hacken, who is the President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. As I said, we're partnering with the Inter-American Dialogue on these series of events about Brazil. Then we have Felipe Campante, who is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of International Economics here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And he's also at the Department of Economics at the Johns Hopkins Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. Felipe was also, he and I went to the same university, and he and I also had the same professor mentor at the same university. So we share that bit of history as well. Felipe is Brazilian, I am Brazilian, and our next panelist, Roberto Simon, is also Brazilian. Roberto is the politics editor for America's Quarterly, and he is the senior director for policy at the Council of the Americas. He is an expert in political risk and policy analysis in Latin America, and he oversees the Council of the Americas Anti-Corruption Working Group. So with that, I would like, I'm going to ask our panelists to speak each for about 10 minutes, and then we are going to open up to a discussion amongst ourselves so that we keep the panel a bit more dynamic than is usually the case in DC. And after that, we're going to open up to questions from you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Monica, for the invitation and the kind words. I would also point out that actually Roberto was a student of mine at Kennedy School at Harvard, so we're all kind of an academic, intellectual family around here. So it's a pleasure to be here and to sort of try to elaborate a little bit on a number of things that I've been thinking about, kind of as a result of all the transformations that Brazil are undergoing. And so I'm going to use sort of my allotted time to sort of think about foreign policy, not per se, but kind of as a window into sort of the broader political institutional development in Brazil and sort of what we might expect going forward in terms of those institutional developments in Brazilian democracy. And the reason why I think foreign policy is a very revealing window into that is the fundamental fact about Brazilian foreign policy, which is that the Brazilian voter, the Brazilian median voter, just could not possibly care less about foreign policy. So Brazilians basically, I think, is sort of a feature of big, insular countries that, are kind of a little bit self-centered, I guess. But Brazilians do not care about foreign policy as a, to a first approximation. But that doesn't make it unimportant. It actually makes it more revealing, because that's an area where sort of governments can play to their base with very little cost in terms of electoral support, right? So they can use that to throw some bones to their most devoted supporters, which might be actually upset about compromises that are done in other arenas. So I think that's something that happened very much. That was very much the case during the PT administration. I think we're still kind of dealing in South America with some of the negative consequences of that in terms of the crisis in Venezuela, for example, precisely because it's kind of a cheap way for governments to signal to their supporters that we're with you in spite of all the things that we're doing kind of in other arenas. Now, I think that looks like it's going to be very much the case with the Bolsonaro administration as well. So that makes it, precisely because Bolsonaro represents such a departure from previous Brazilian governments. So that makes some of the foreign policy signals very unusual, right, so far. And that's kind of the first thing that jumps to the eye. So many things are kind of unusual. So one, perhaps less unusual, is sort of the embrace of the U.S. as a sort of, in a very open and unabashed way, which is, we can get back to this, and I guess Peter is going to talk about that a lot, but also sort of some weird focal points in the discussion in terms of foreign policy that are very odd if you think about sort of the trajectory of Brazilian foreign policies. So we've been hearing a lot about Israel, or we've been hearing about like Hungary, and this is not usual for what we have seen from Brazilian diplomacy over the years. And the question is, what do these have in common? And I would say that they have, they are kind of part of an axis of illiberalism to which Bolsonaro clearly ideologically aligned. So Viktor Orban or Benjamin Netanyahu, so these are kind of, extreme, in their different guises, they are representatives of sort of a relatively extreme right-wing view to which Bolsonaro clearly aligns himself. And right now, the current administration in the U.S. is very much, the leading light, the leader of the unfree world in some sense, sort of a leading light of illiberalism in the world. And there's something ironic to that, in that the Bolsonaro administration, makes a big point about ideology and how, to sort of condemn ideology, and they're actually following this highly ideological path in terms of foreign policy. But that actually brings me to the second point, which is we don't actually know yet what Bolsonaro's foreign policy is going to be. So there are these signals, but clearly there are some tensions within the Bolsonaro administration, which I think underscore the fact that there are some tensions in his base of support that overlap with foreign policy very much. So there are conflicting visions. There's this extreme right component, represented by the foreign minister, one of Bolsonaro's sons, is very much aligning himself as part of this international anti-globalist right-wing movement. And so that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have the military, which is a very big part of the Bolsonaro coalition, so to speak, and traditionally has had a much more pragmatic view, but also the alignment with the U.S., for instance, is something that does not come naturally necessarily to the more nationalistic streak of the military. So there are these competing views, and it's not clear at all who is going to come out ahead in terms of that dispute. So it's not clear what the Bolsonaro foreign policy will end up being, because clearly there are important players on both sides, right? So the military is clearly a very, very important part of Bolsonaro's support, but on the other hand, the more ideological right, and also with sort of the evangelical base of support, is very important for Bolsonaro as well, which has reproduced a little bit the dynamic of the Christian right that we've seen in the U.S. over the last few decades. I think that is starting to play out a little bit in Brazil. So these are important components of Bolsonaro's coalition, and I think partly due to the circumstances, as we know, Bolsonaro has been in the hospital for most of his term so far because of still dealing with the consequences of the attempt on his life during the campaign. So he has been kind of not as active as I guess he would have been otherwise. So it's not clear where he will come down, and I think to the extent that there's been a lot of back and forth in other realms of Bolsonaro's administration, and that is still very much an unknown. I think where he will come off, he doesn't seem to be a particularly decisive figure, at least so far. So we don't know where this is going, and I would suggest, or at least that my feeling is that either side poses certain challenges to Brazilian democracy and to Brazilian institutions going forward. On the one hand, it's pretty easy for Latin Americans to conjure sort of the military as sort of a threatening element to democracy. It's kind of the old school, threat to democracy that's been present, since time immemorial. But on the other hand, sort of that other streak is very much aligned with this 21st century illiberal vision that I think is very much, present across many different parts of the world. And I think what the added component that is, very much in play right now is the unpredictability that this adds to the foreign policy dimension, as it does to other, arenas as well in the Brazilian government. And I don't think that we have quite seen that much tension in terms of foreign policy, as Monica has mentioned. I think foreign policy, Brazil, with some fluctuations, but tended to be pretty consistent in terms of the ultimate vision in terms of foreign policy. So we don't have a lot of precedent for this, as far as the recent past goes, for this kind of tension. So I think that adds unpredictability to the scenario, and that is typically not good. So I think that is true for arenas beyond foreign policy, but it's again, foreign policy is a particularly revealing window into that broader picture. So I think it's unclear what's going to happen, and whatever happens, there are risks, different risks that I think are involved, and will warrant a lot of attention going forward. So that's my general sense in terms of what we have in store.
Thank you, Felipe. Peter.
Thank you, Monica, for doing most of the work on this as well. As Monica has said, that I'm going to be talking about U.S.-Brazilian relations. I try to keep it narrow. And let me say, this is the story of a courtship, that the Brazilians are courting the United States, and the United States is courting Brazil. And what that simply means is that both sides are approaching each other sort of in a rather gentle way. They're both sort of praising and applauding each other without very concrete to what they're yet proposing. And let me say that this is all occurring, this courtship, after at least a half a dozen years of very cool, some people even call it a frozen relationships between the two countries. And we can go into why that happened and how that happened in history, but that itself would take up more than my 10 minutes. So, but here it is, the start of what looks like a new period of warmth in the relationship. Virtually everybody on Trump's team, Trump himself, Pompeo, Bolton, even the ambassador to Latin America, Marco Rubio, have all said wonderful things about Brazil, about the new government, about the opportunities. Marco Rubio, in fact, gave a speech laying out an agenda for the next 4 years for the U.S.-Brazil relationship. And everyone seems enthused. Pompeo and Bolton have already visited Brazil. I think their plans are in the works now for a visit by Bolsonaro to the United States very soon. But I think, like I said, the best way to look at it, at least from my perspective, is an interesting courtship at this period. Now, and that, in some sense, is disagreement with you, that rather than filling in an ideological agenda, I sort of see a lot of what the announcements and declarations from Brasilia are precisely appealing to the United States. What all the things that Bolsonaro and his team have talked about. The skepticism about climate change, the announcement soon after the election that the plans would be to remove Brazil from the Paris Accords. There are others that pledge, like that you mentioned, of moving the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. An invitation to set up a military base for the United States. And it goes on like that. And of course, the support for a very tough approach to Venezuela, anti-left proposition, and even they talked about reconsidering the relationship with China, and Bolsonaro made a trip to Taiwan, which got China a little upset. And in any event, it's very clear that those things, what hangs together, is not necessarily an ideology so much, I think, as a way of sort of appealing to what the United States wants from Brazil. Now, it's true that Bolsonaro and his team have had to back off, walk away from many of these statements, that they can't do it. I could go through them one by one, but China, it's very hard to sort of back away from China when China is your largest trading partner, and it's growing faster than everybody else. And the growth has largely been because of China, Brazil's, and Brazil is in the middle of a financial economic crisis that cannot. Similarly, trying to walk back a little the moving the embassy to Jerusalem. Why? Because Brazil sells $11 billion worth of meat and chicken and other things in the Middle East. And the military was even worried about terrorism in Brazil. And it goes on that they can't quite seem to really sort of take a stand and hold it, which seems even more to question the ideological. But certainly it does point to Brazil's wanting a new, revised, stronger, deeper relationship with the United States. And the U.S. reaction so far is to say, we would welcome that. We want that. And the questions are, is this a good idea for Brazil? Is it a good idea for the United States? And why now, after so many years, or that the relationship has been not antagonistic. I want to make clear that the Brazil-U.S. relationship has not been antagonistic. It's ranged, they've been cordial, there's a lot of warmth when the presidents and vice presidents and others visit each other. They've just never been able to find enough common interests and enough agreement to move forward politically, to really reach agreement, to do what Mexico and the United States or India and the United States were able to do, to decide that they're going to have a strong relationship and then figure out how to do it, rather than trying to sort of set the basis and see if it works. And in any event, the question is this possible now? And there's no question in my mind that Brazil and the United States would gain a lot from a closer relationship, a more constructive relationship. And certainly, there's no doubt in my mind that the most important for both of the countries would be greater economic exchange, would be more trade, more investment, more exchange of technology. And Brazil would be the larger beneficiary of all that. And why hasn't that occurred? Well, it's largely because Brazil and the United States have differences about the way they run their economies, about the willingness to accept certain rules on the trade side, and simply they've never been able to say, we want an agreement sufficiently to sit at the table until we sort of narrow the differences. And my own sense is that this is possible. I mean, what's so surprising to me is that the Mexicans were able, several analysts have said that Mexico and the U.S. were further apart, had more differences over economic relations than the U.S. When they negotiated the NAFTA Accord, than the U.S. and Brazil had during most of the period of Fernando Henrique, Lula, and that there was more agreement there. And yet, what Mexico and the U.S., according to, I mean, I wasn't there at the time, they were both given orders to sit at the table until they found an agreement, and they found an agreement. And that agreement, you'll notice, omitted two of the most important items, yet they reached the NAFTA agreement. What were the two items? One for the United States was the whole question of oil. I mean, Mexico was a large source of oil, and they reached no agreements there. And for the Mexicans, it was labor mobility, and they never reached an agreement on that, as we well know. So it does seem, and well, I could go through a lot. I can see my time slipping away. There's other reasons, and one thing that struck me in a conversation with several people, particularly in the Obama administration, who said that, you know, the U.S. can't push out, can't do what it wants to do in the Americas, can't implement its agenda in the Americas unless Brazil is ready to cooperate. And later he they said that they at least have to tolerate what the U.S. will do. And I think that that is a major point now for why the U.S. wants a closer relationship. They want several things out of the relationship. Most importantly, they would like to see, they were very concerned, if there was one objective of U.S. policy in Latin America, perhaps different from the wall on the Mexican border, would be that they would like China to have less of a presence, certainly not more of a presence, more influence. They really, and conversation after conversation with diplomats in the US and in Latin America, that this is a major theme. How do you reduce the footprint of China in Latin America? And that's one issue that I would like Brazil's help on. And Bolsonaro started off by suggesting that he would be helpful. Secondly, Venezuela, which has now emerged as the issue, and you know, one only has to think for 2 minutes before realizing that without Brazil signing on to the Lima Declaration, without participating with Chile, Peru, Colombia, etc., that the U.S. and Maduro could breathe a little easier if Brazil had joined with Mexico to sort of call for negotiations rather than assigning Guaido as the president. So that was a second big issue that the U.S. would like to see. And in any event, the next question, of course, is, can this work out? Is there any possibility that they will find a way to sort of, you know, the U.S. wants the sort of basically limit the role of China and perhaps go after Venezuela and the other members of the trio of Trinity, the trio of terror, or the Trinity of terror. And the question is whether that, combined with some kind of economic engagement between the U.S. and Mexico, could somehow be arrived at. Big problems in all of this. One gets the impression that the U.S., Brazil wanting this economic relationship is more the decision of the finance minister, Guedes, than it is of necessary Bolsonaro, but it doesn't matter. It seems like it's going to be very hard to do, both because of the interests of Brazil as a country, and take one example, the China issue, which is probably still the most important for the U.S. The China issue, Brazil and China are now trading almost 50%, 60% more than the U.S. and Brazil are trading. That's one evidence, so in Brazil's interest. Secondly, the largest coalition of support that the Bolsonaro government has in the legislature is the agricultural business, rural coalition. Now, where do the agricultural products go? They go mainly to China. Just seems that while somehow this seemed like a good idea at some point, the politics and the basic interests of Brazil really don't work very well. And one could go into a variety of the other issues that we're talking about. And I think the biggest problem is, in fact, that I think Brazil particularly, and I'm going to end here because I'm probably over my time limit, would lose one of its real claims for international influence, which it had for a while, that lost when its economy began to deteriorate and the quality of governance began to go down. But it was its independence internationally, that it wasn't choosing sides. It had only 2 trade agreements, free trade agreements, one with Jordan and one with Israel, and then one with Palestine, actually 3. Mm-hmm. So the idea, it had you know, it had good relations with Iran, and it had good relations with the U.S., basically. It had good relations with Greece and Turkey. And that it's going to lose if it sort of pursues this agenda. That's make it difficult for it to pursue the agenda because it's going to be costly, but politically also very difficult.
Thank you, Peter. That's an interesting perspective in trade isolationism giving way for foreign policy room for maneuver. So we'll come back to that, I think, when we have our panel discussion. But thank you very much. Let me pass the word to Roberto.
Monica, thank you so much for the invitation. It's truly an honor to be here. Peter, Filippi, my former professor. My argument here will be divided in roughly 3 parts. The first part is the following. I think the last 2 months represented the biggest foreign policy shift in Brazil in decades, full stop, right? But I think the second part of the argument is what we're seeing now, and the story over the next months and probably over the next couple of years will be what it means to have a period of accommodation. And what it means to implement these very quote-unquote strange objectives that the new Bolsonaro administration has in the international arena. And third, I think the longer-term question is what this will mean in terms of the long-term equilibrium for Brazilian foreign policy over the next decades or so, right? So let me start unpacking this. And I'll start in October 28th. My colleague Brian Winter and I wrote a piece on foreign affairs. It was the day that Bolsonaro was elected. And the argument was, you know, Bolsonaro was about to preside over the biggest overhaul in foreign policy over the past decades. And we decided to write the piece basically after hearing from some people in Itamaraty and in the foreign policy community in Brazil, a kind of a strange demeanor that, you know, after all, Bolsonaro was saying a lot of things and it was part of the heated campaign rhetoric, but in the end, you know, Itamaraty was a very strong machine. You had a consolidated, you know, foreign policy bureaucracy in Brazil. Academia was getting stronger, and we would inevitably see a return to the mean, right? That we shouldn't be that scared of Bolsonaro. And we were saying that actually we thought that this was not true. And why? Because we thought that foreign policy for Bolsonaro would be a low-hanging fruit, that he would face very high incentives to change dramatically Brazilian foreign policy. And I think this goes back to what Filippi was saying. First, foreign policy was a very easy way for Bolsonaro to kind of deliver his ideological commitments to his core base, to PSL, the Trumpists in his campaign. And it was something that he could achieve without going through Congress. In Brazil, contrary to the United States, in Brazil, the executive branch has a quasi-monopoly over foreign policy. Here, Congress has the Foreign Affairs Commission in the Senate and in the House. I worked as a journalist in Brazil covering international affairs and Brazilian foreign policy for several years. And the worst use of my time was to go to the Foreign Affairs Commission in the Brazilian Senate or in the Brazilian House. They were like about, you know, chatting with investors, not taking real decisions. Basically, what I'm saying is that, you know, the president can do whatever he wants when it comes to foreign policy, with some exceptions. So in the end, it was very easy for Bolsonaro to dramatically change things over 2 months. And dramatically change things, of course, he's not implementing policy. His administration is very recent, but promising a lot of stuff. So we published that on October 28th. Then we had Araújo becoming foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo, who it was absolutely unprecedented for a mid-level career diplomat in Brazil to be catapulted to the rank of minister. Never happened before in Brazil. We had several ministers who were political figures like Serra, like Aloysio Nunes in recent years, but typically when a career diplomat was chosen was a highly accomplished ambassador who would become minister. In the case of Araújo, the reason why he was appointed was exclusively based on ideology. He had published an article calling Trump the Hail Mary pass of Western civilization. He was very close to Olavo de Carvalho, who was a philosopher, quote-unquote philosopher here, lives near Washington. So this was absolutely unprecedented. The Itamaraty and the foreign policy community in Brazil was in shock. Then going back to what Peter was saying, there is this very unique moment in US-Brazil relations, right? John Bolton, on his way to the G20 summit in Bolsonaro, made a stop in Brazil to meet with President Bolsonaro in Rio. President Bolsonaro gave him a military salute, and I think in diplomacy, this type of symbology means a lot. Then, of course, the son of President Bolsonaro came here to the United States to meet with Jared Kushner. He was with now the guy who's now the senior advisor for foreign policy at Planalto, Felipe Martins. Then, of course, Secretary of State Pompeo was in Bolsonaro's inauguration. Araújo was here last week. Bolsonaro is coming in late March. Marco Rubio is calling for the United States to go big in Brazil. He published a piece with that title on CNN. Basically, we're seeing something that it's completely unprecedented in US-Brazil relations. Then we have Venezuela. And I think the decision of recognizing Guaido as the interim president, it's not surprising itself. I think the counterfactual here, what would Temer as president do? I think he would do the same. Because Temer would not be with AMLO and Uruguay, and on the other side, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, and the rest of Latin America and the United States, of course. But the key issue for me is the motivation behind Brazil's decision. And when you look at what Araújo has been saying, what Felipe Martins has been saying, they look at the Venezuelan crisis as this episode in a decade-long struggle against the left in Latin America. So the discussion is not really about democracy in Latin America. It's about Foro de São Paulo, who's a quasi-conspiratorial theory that the left is articulated in Latin America to overthrow Christians and good people, whatever that means. And then you have to stop Maduro no matter what. This is really important because it will be determinant of Brazil's position when a true transition begins in Venezuela. Because what will you do with the roughly 40% of Venezuelans who declare themselves Chavistas? They may hate Maduro, but they have they identify as they like Chavez or the role that Chavez played in history. This is according to polls. And then after Venezuela, let me see my notes here, we had, of course, the UN Global Compact on migration that Brazil decided to withdraw, although we don't have a real problem of migration in Brazil. It was 100% ideological. Mr. Orban did it. Salvini did it. The Chileans, surprisingly, also did it. But it was also announced on Twitter by the president to mobilize his base and so on and so forth. Brazil did not withdraw officially from the Paris Agreement, but in practice, Brazil has abandoned its carbon emissions targets. The foreign minister is a climate change denier. The Minister of the Environment is also a climate change denier who promises to ignore fully the issue of climate change to focus on business opportunities for agriculture. So we also have that. And on trade, I think, for me, it's a big question mark because we haven't seen anything meaningful yet. I do think that the Paulo Guedes, the Minister of Economy, Paulo Guedes, and his team will actively try to get part of the trade agenda, particularly on trade and investments. But at the same time, they don't have the technical expertise to negotiate. They don't have people who spent years at the WTO or negotiating trade agreements. We're negotiating now with a trade agreement that was announced last year with Chile and so on and so forth. So Itamaraty will have to play a role, and it remains to be seen what will happen there. So after going through this list, is this the new normal in Brazilian foreign policy? And I think, so the alternative, is this the new normal, or are we seeing a period of unusual activity that will lead to some accommodation? I think the latter is more likely. And if we take a step back and look at the history of foreign policy in Brazil, I think there are two periods that have some resemblance to what we're seeing here. The first one is 1964, when Brazil went through a dramatic foreign policy shift, and the other one is 1989. With the election of colors. Let me start with 1964. Brazilian democracy was ended by a military coup. President Castelo Branco became, Marshal Castelo Branco became the president, and Brazil aligned itself with the United States, sent militaries to the Dominican Republic to quash a rebellion. And after 10 years, so in 1974, when Ernesto Geisel became president, Brazil had a very similar foreign policy that Jango and Jânio Quadros. They came all around. And then in 1989, of course, Collor was elected with a promise of fully modernizing Brazilian economy, free trade. It was the high time of Mercosur, etc. Collor was impeached. Itamar Franco resumed kind of the foreign policy that was Sarney's foreign policy. By the way, the minister at the time was a guy named Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who became president with a very similar foreign policy. Meaning, I think, when we take a step back, and I think we let history kick in, I think we'll see some sort of accommodation, but again, I don't think we're going back. It's not a return to the mean. We'll reach a new equilibrium that still remains very uncertain. And I'll stop in 1 second. The way I'm seeing here things moving forward is, I think the analysis needs to have 3 different levels, right? There is one level, which is men, and mostly men, because there are no women in the Brazilian government right now. So basically, the people who are...
There's one, the human rights minister.
The human rights minister, right.
The evangelical pastor will come back to that.
Minister of Agriculture.
And the Minister of Agriculture. Okay, so we have 2. So basically, I think, we have to look closely at the dispute of power behind foreign policy. I know Monica wrote an interesting piece recently on how the militaries, particularly Mourão, but others are trying, to become more influential on vis-a-vis the foreign policy machine. So I think we have 3 main groups, right? We have the Bolsonaristas, we have the militaries, and we have Paulo Guedes. I think this vying for power will be very interesting to see, and will be certainly determinant for foreign policy moving forward. The second level, I would say, is the interplay of interest groups and the government. So the agricultural caucus in Congress, but I would say also big companies exporting agricultural products that tend to dislike the idea that climate change doesn't exist, because they know it's bad for business. For Brazil to be branded as a country fighting against climate change is bad for them. And for protein exporters, the idea of moving the embassy, as Peter mentioned, from the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it's also frightening. Or the idea that the foreign minister is portraying Brazil as a Christian crusader and is kind of anti-Islam is also frightening, when a huge chunk of your exports are going to the Islamic world. And then I think the third, and also very important, when you're talking about trade liberalization, there's a reason why trade liberalization did not happen in Brazil until now. It's because industrial elites are super powerful, the Fiespes, etc. And it's going to be a big battle to see how they can shape the foreign policy agenda moving forward. But the third level of analysis that I would put is, Brazil's or long-term interests as a country, and as a state. I think, one question that we should be asking is, can Brazil simultaneously be very aligned with the United States and seek a more prominent role in international affairs? I don't think so. Can Brazil at the same time, campaign to be considered a quote-unquote Western country, as the foreign minister wants, to join the OECD because Brazil is a Western country, and be more integrated to the global economy, while we know that the big drivers of growth will be in Asia, in countries like China, India, etc. I think there will be also some tension there. So I'll stop here. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everybody. Let me, in my role as moderator slash something, let me use that role to explore a little bit some of the issues that the three of you have raised, and in particular this tension between sort of, is foreign policy at this moment in Brazil mostly ideological or is it not? And the role of the generals, which I think is, we've talked about the military, the three of you mentioned the military, but I think it deserves a deeper exploration because, as all of us here know, Bolsonaro's rise to power and Bolsonaro's anti-establishment campaign was extremely effective, but it was very effective for a host of reasons, including the fact that he was very much able to sense and be the thermometer of what the country seemed, where the country and where the population seemed to be moving at that particular juncture, at this particular juncture that we're facing now. But it also reflected something else. I mean, we saw how the Lava Jato corruption scandal has been absolutely devastating for Brazilian institutions. And this is for Brazilian institutions in general. It has hurt the executive power because there were people in the executive branch involved in corruption. It has hurt the legislative power because there were many politicians in the legislative power involved in corruption. And it has hurt the judiciary because at times the judiciary has been perceived to be over-politicized throughout this whole process. So the two institutions, let's think of it this way, the two institutions that were basically left standing after all of this were the military on the one hand and the churches on the other. The Catholic Church in Brazil no longer has the same influence that it used to have. The church in Brazil now, or at least when we speak of the churches, I should put it in the plural, we're really thinking of the evangelical movement, and in particular the neo-Pentecostal evangelical movements, the ones that are really very closely aligned, and this is not by chance, with the religious right here in the US. And the types of agendas that they defend, which do have a very, very high ideological content, Felipe and I have been writing about these things separately, but we're writing something together as well on these themes. This very deep ideological content that exists in this agenda is very much reflected in the Bolsonaro foreign policy agenda, if we were to put it this way. So I'm sort of disagreeing a bit with you too, Peter, in that I
could tell.
I do view the agenda as having this ideological streak that's coming from this base of support for Bolsonaro, which is very aligned with this religious right. This religious right in Brazil isn't new. It's been there for a while. What is new about it is that for the first time, we saw it become a cohesive movement. It's always been very fragmented. It's had different influences in different parts of the country, but it's never really united in the way that it did during the elections of last year. And they really did. They provided really strong support for Bolsonaro, and the evangelical pastors played a very strong role in getting him elected, including because if there's one thing that these evangelical churches have in Brazil is capillarity. They're everywhere. They're in every single neighborhood. So they're really able to sort of have that kind of role. And on the other hand, the military. It's not by chance that the Bolsonaro government has 7 ministers in the cabinet who are 4-star generals, and the VP himself, the vice president himself, who is a general, plus a number of other generals that are occupying other tiers of government, which the last time I checked, I think there were 18 generals in the 18 generals in the Bolsonaro government. And the really interesting thing that I think we should explore a little bit more before we open up to Q&A is how these two forces, which have come out of these elections as the only institutions that were left standing, are now sort of at logheads, and are banging heads over foreign policy. Because we have seen, since the start of the administration, we have seen a consistent pushback from the generals, the VP perhaps being the most outspoken because he is himself a very outspoken person, and he's had a lot of experience abroad, including in Venezuela, by the way, where he's very forcibly pushed the opposite position of saying, okay, yes, we can support Guaido, but we don't have to do anything else. We're not going to intervene. We're not going to do anything of that sort. He has also pushed back strongly against the idea of moving the embassy to Jerusalem. He has pushed back strongly against the anti-China sentiment. But very tellingly, he has been paving the way for the technocrats and for Paulo Guedes and his pension reform and his agenda to actually be pushed through. Because on the other side of this, on the church side of this, on the ideological side of this, there's a very strong agenda to change social, certain legislation regarding social and human rights. And a lot of this has to do with the typical sort of social values, family values that we've come to associate with the religious right here in the US. So this general has come out in an interview very vocally saying, look, this agenda is not a priority for Brazil. The priority for Brazil is really the economic agenda. That's what needs to get pushed through Congress. So we've seen a lot of evidence of a lot of tension between those two institutions that were left standing on foreign policy and on other issues. So the generals fighting with the evangelicals. And I'd like, if we could, in the minutes that we have left before we open up to Q&A, to explore that angle of things a little bit, because this is unique, right? We haven't seen this happen in Brazil before. So if anyone wants to take a jab at that.
Well, let me, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead. Yeah.
No, what puzzles me, though, a couple of things about Brazil foreign policy. Long time I've been puzzled by some of it, but one here, when you say it has an ideological underpinning, and then you talk about the Christian churches, the evangelical churches, you talk about the military, you talk about the agricultural interests, you're really talking about interests. Now, each of those groups has an ideology, but it doesn't add up to a sort of some kind of grand ideology. And indeed, the question that is puzzling to me is when you look at all the things that Bolsonaro has said, Guedes has said, the finance minister, what would be for the Bolsonaro government a successful foreign policy? Where would Brazil be if he was successful? What would Brazil look like? What would it look like internationally? And the second question, Brazil is something of a regional power, and we mentioned only one other Latin American country in the discussion was Venezuela. And the relation with Argentina is very important, et cetera. And so what would a successful policy look like, I think is crucial to answering some of your questions. I mean, that you asked too many to.
If I can say something about this, kind of, picking up on what Peter has said, I think I have to disagree to agree with Peter in some sense. It's like the opposite. I think we agree in sort of because the fact that they have an ideological component doesn't mean that they have a coherent ideology, right? And that's and that's at the heart of it. Some parts of the base of the Bolsonaro coalition, if you will, have a distinct ideological vision, but that is not shared by other parts of the coalition. And then what comes out of this becomes very uncertain. And that's where I think the crucial challenge comes, which is fundamentally, I think Bolsonaro is a very weak presence. Because, if you think about the military, for instance, the military is a highly hierarchical, meritocratic institution, and Bolsonaro was a very undistinguished officer. right? So his relationship to the generals is very awkward, right? Because he is the political leader. He was elected.
Deferential. It's been
yeah,
deferential.
but he knows that, they are not beneath him, right? And that creates sort of this weird dynamic where it doesn't seem, at least for now, maybe, we haven't seen him in action much because of, sort of health reasons and so on. But it's not clear at all to me that he will be able to resolve these underlying conflicts. So I think there is a risk that we'll have drift, that we'll have just incoherence coming out of that tension until something forces something to emerge out of this incoherence. So I think the uncertainty is profound because there is this ideological incoherence in his or tension in his base, and it's not clear at all that he's in a position to really play the role of solving that tension.
Yeah, of mediating.
With the
Roberto,
risk
do you want to come in on your accommodation point with respect to this?
with the risk of sounding a bit postmodern, I think all foreign policies are ideological to a certain extent, in the sense that they reflect the ideological preferences and the political affiliations of the president. This is particularly true in Brazil. When we think about Lula on the stage with Evo Morales with a necklace of coca leaves, or with Chavez, or we think about the relationship that Fernando Henrique Cardoso had with Bill Clinton, with some areas of this. There were like clear ideological DNAs there. The question for me is, what will happen with these three groups that represent very different interests and ideologies? And I refer to, the militaries, the true believers, PSL, evangelicals, etc., and the Guedes crew. When these ideologies start, conflicting. And with the military specifically, I had the opportunity to work with them in Haiti, and I think Haiti was the big laboratory for this. Many of the generals who are now in power were force commanders in Haiti, starting with General Heleno, who's Bolsonaro's main advisor right now. And of course, usually what you see in the Brazilian press is, look, the militaries have a very nationalist view of politics. You have to read what like Meira Matos was writing in the 60s or Golbery to understand them. It's not that clear. They changed dramatically. And I think the guys who are majors and coronels today, they were like kids at the end of the military regime, right? And they were very bothered by the fact that the Lula and the Dilma administration were kind of anti-US in some points, or they were too close to Venezuela. They were really bothered, and they would tell you, off the record, of course. Mm-hmm. So I think the military's changed, and I think most of them would agree that, a better relationship with the United States would be good. But when you talk about having a U.S. base in Brazilian soil, this is crazy.
This is a no-no.
Yeah, this is absolutely a no-no.
Yeah, so to try to answer your question as to what a successful foreign policy would look like, I will answer it as an economist. So as an economist, what I would say to you is this. Brazil has been absolutely isolated from the world over the past 30 years, if not more. When countries in Latin America were moving to open up to trade, so you had, Chile doing that, you had Peru doing it, you had Colombia doing it, you had Mexico, of course, at the forefront of all of this, and then they all united, create the Pacific Alliance. So you had a number of countries moving in that direction. Other countries, not so much. They were kind of not doing much. You had, of course, Argentina with its series of crises. It couldn't really afford to do very much. But Brazil had the option of doing something for a large chunk of its history, particularly in the 90s, and it chose not to. It had the opportunity to do that in the 2000s under Lula, and it chose not to. For a brief period of time, it had the opportunity to do it under Dilma, and it chose not to. So the choice has always been for isolationism as opposed to anything else, which of course has an effect on diplomacy and foreign policy, and the standing that the country has in the world. So my answer to your question, Peter, is the success for me would be measured, and this is not taking a view on what the Bolsonaro may or may not think about this issue. I think certainly Paulo Guedes views this as a positive thing because he himself has already actually exposed those views. But I would say that success would be measured in terms of how much you can advance in the next 4 years in opening up Brazil to trade and investment, and in removing some of the barriers that have been in Brazil, and some of them have actually been reenacted in the recent past. So things like, using local content requirements in a very ad hoc basis in every single sector and being sort of the champion of that kind of non-transparent policy over the past few years. Reversing all of that and moving to a situation where Brazil is looking to open up trade, whether it be, through more trade facilitation agreements with the U.S., whether it be, making actual consistent efforts towards regulatory convergence, whether it be any of the things that are really up for grabs in terms of trade policy and investment policy for Brazil, I'd say that'd be a huge success and a big progress going forward. And in a sense, it is low-hanging fruit because a number of these initiatives do not need Congress. You can just do it. I mean, as we were saying before, Brazil does have a lot of power to do foreign policy through the executive branch. That's also true of trade policy in many respects. It's also true of investment policy in many respects. So there's a lot that can actually be done, and which are low-hanging fruits that this government could do, especially having a minister like Paulo Guedes who's very open to these ideas. So to me, that would be the silver lining to our discussion today. Unless any of you have anything else you'd like to add? Go
one
ahead.
point for Paulo Guedes, the way that the Ministry of Economy was restructured. Now, if you think about CAMEX, for instance, he has the votes to lower tariffs unilaterally.
Right.
Even in the Temer administration, unilaterally, I mean, in the Temer administration, you had, maybe, the Ministry of Planning voting yes, but then the Ministry of Energy would say no, and they would lose the vote. Now, Guedes himself has the power to do it.
Yeah, this is a very important point because trade policy in Brazil has never been kind of underneath one agency or one ministry. It's sort of been distributed across the board. And with this unification of ministries under Paulo Guedes, there's more consistency in where trade policy is placed, although the Itamaraty still has a lot of influence over that. So that has diminished somewhat, Peter.
So basically, what I understand you're saying, maybe I'm wrong, but is that success means the failure of the ideological agenda and the success of the technocratic agenda.
Not necessarily, because funnily enough, and this is something that perhaps a lot of you may not know, the evangelicals who came out in support of Bolsonaro, they published a manifesto in October of 2018, which was a really interesting document that Felipe and I combed through, in great detail. And that particular document was not focused only on the social agenda, on the family values agenda. There was a lot on that. But there was a portion of this document which was written up as a government platform, and this group actually handed this document over to Bolsonaro right before the runoff at the end of October of last year. And there was a detailed portion of the document that spoke of trade specifically. So it spoke of opening the country up to trade. It spoke of, getting rid of isolationism. It spoke of a lot of these things, which comes back to a point that Felipe made earlier, which is the ideological incoherence. Because, you have some of these guys from the religious right actually embracing policies that are very pro-market and are very liberalizing in the sense that we've been discussing. But on the other hand, you know, you have a portion of those guys who are anti-globalists, as reflected by, you know, the words of the foreign minister himself. So I think within the whole, going back to your point about ideology and Felipe's about ideological incoherence, that's exactly where we see that tension. So it's not necessarily incompatible with the ideology. It just depends on what the ideology ends up being. So unless you guys have anything else to add, I would like to pass the word on to the audience and start taking questions. Okay, so I would ask, when I call on you, we have microphones around the room. I would ask that you please state your name and affiliation and make your best effort to make what you say a question. Okay. So let me start right there and then come back here to the front.
So I'm Nick Burns, intern at the Wilson Center. I wanted to ask Dr. Simon a little bit about this sort of anti-globalist faction in the Bolsonaro government. A lot of these other factions are more or less known entities, right? The evangelicals, generals, but you know, this group, I mean, although certainly there's similarities to Orban and Trump here, they seem to me, I guess, a little more mysterious. So just, or if any of you had any more insights into not just what these people are against, but if anything, what they're for, and what to sort of, a little more on their ideological sort of content, if there is such a thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think a big part of what they say is directly borrowed from Trump's playbook. And sometimes, in the Brazilian context, it doesn't make much sense. For instance, the rage against migrants or things like that, that it's not an actual problem in Brazil, potentially with the exception of
Venezuela.
northern Roraima. It's a state in the border with Venezuela that really received thousands and thousands of Venezuelan refugees. But I think there is this, you know, this idea that Trump, again, in this crazy, and I shouldn't say the word, I shouldn't use the word crazy, but in this reality, this space disconnected from reality, there is this idea that Trump is an enlightened leader who's, you know, leading the United States to an era of progress and security with a border in a wall. And people in Brazil take this seriously. And they're very influential on social media, on Twitter. And they partially explain Bolsonaro's success with upper middle class men in Brazil, which were, you know, the core group that supported Bolsonaro. If you compare, you know, Bolsonaro's votes in different demographical groups, you see that urban middle class men between, you know, late 20s to, you know, early 40s were the real group where he got a lot of votes. But again, it's connecting, you know, Brazil to this axis that is fighting globalism with Salvini in Italy, with Netanyahu in Israel, with Trump in the United States, with, you know, Brexit in the UK. But, you know, will it move the needle in terms of the next election? I'm not sure. I think it's for the consumption of a very specific group that, again, it's overrepresented on social media, and they do make a lot of noise. Yeah.
Hi, Kevin Healy from Georgetown University. I'm adjunct faculty in the Latin American Studies Center. I wanted to ask about a component of foreign policy for Brazil, which would be its drug policy toward its neighbors. Brazil cities, we know, particularly Sao Paulo and Rio, are plagued by all kinds of violence and crime and illegal markets for cocaine. And I'm wondering, this government, which has such an image of law and order and being tough, even compared to the Filipino government at times, what is the view, what is the policy that's being formulated toward its neighbors, like Bolivia and Peru, as far as counter-narcotics? Is this going to be ratcheted up as a drug war aspect, or is this going to be something that's going to just lie dormant?
Thank you. Anyone?
I mean, in my view, it's pretty disconnected. I mean, it's not perceived in Brazil as being something that, I mean, there's some connection in terms of, oh, we need to have strong borders, and I think like the military is very much, has always been concerned with, the borders, and especially because a big chunk of the Brazilian border is like in the jungle and sort of sparsely populated and so on. But I think the approach to, crime and anti-drug policy is very much a repression, like a domestic repression approach, and I think it doesn't need congressional approval. It's just being implemented. Just this week, the Rio police killed like 14 people in a single day. I think it's just that's the policy, and it's kind of disconnected from this cross-border, to a large extent, kind of disconnected from this cross-border angle. At least that's my perception. But.
Yeah, I agree. And at the moment, we have, Sergio Moro, who's occupying the Justice Ministry, and at the same time dealing with security issues. And most of the agenda, and in fact, the agenda that has recently been put forth and elaborated and published, is an agenda that's focused on domestic issues alone. It's not really focusing on neighbors or on that kind of foreign policy reach. So I think that hasn't quite trickled down into the mentality of this government, that actually engaging with the neighbors in terms of looking at these issues from a broader regional perspective is really important and should be the way to be addressing this, rather than just focusing. Again, it's the insular view that Brazil always tends to have, just because it's very, very large and very big and occupies most of South America. But it's the wrong way to do things, because of course, whatever is done in Brazil affects its neighbors, and whatever its neighbors do affect Brazil. So, but there hasn't been any articulation of foreign policy in that dimension. The entirety of the drug issue has been focused on domestic. There doesn't seem to be at the moment, no. There does not seem to be at the moment. I would expect, however, that at some point, if the military are playing a larger and larger role in the government, they would be the ones to flag that issue.
I think it's hard to find almost anywhere
There's a
in
question
Latin America,
over here first.
Yeah, just anywhere in Latin America where the crackdown, the hard line is not more popular. Very few countries, and those tend to be countries with lower crime rates, where you begin to see, there have been some experiments. Brazil had some very successful experiments, but then there were new outbreaks, and the whole thing tended to break down. And we've seen that in country after country, whether in Central America, and very few countries have anything more than a very hardline policy.
Yeah. Please.
Stallings from Brown University and GW and Tsinghua University in Beijing. To me, the elephant in the room, which is only Peter really gave a lot of play to, is what's going to happen with China. And Peter really talked about it in terms of the U.S. interest in China vis-a-vis Brazil. Monica says, well, a successful Brazilian foreign policy is opening up to trade and investment. Well, of course, Brazil's largest trade partner is China, and I don't know how China fits in terms of investment. It's certainly one of the largest investors in Brazil. So how is China? And Brazil has been very involved in China. It hasn't been isolated at all, both bilaterally and through the BRICS. How is China going to fit into this picture of the new foreign policy of Brazil?
So that's an excellent question, and I think some of us touched on that, but very sort of tangentially. We haven't really addressed it head on. For me, in my definition of successful foreign policy, successful foreign policy and successful trade policy has to involve China. I mean, there's simply no way that Brazil can say, okay, we are not going to have relations with China, or we're going to significantly reduce our relations with China. There's a dependency there, and Brazil does depend to a large extent on China, and has created a symbiotic relationship with China in a lot of respect. Now, does that eventually conflict with, you know, the U.S.-Brazil side of things, and to what extent does it conflict? I think this is something that we have to wait and see how it plays out, but it is a potential point of tension. So all this love that we see right now between Brazil and the U.S. could go away, I think, relatively quickly once a more pragmatic approach, if that indeed is what prevails, and we don't know, but if a more pragmatic approach is in the end what prevails through, let's say, the action of the generals, which, by the way, have already put out there that their view is, you know, Brazil should not, under any circumstance, disengage with China. And in fact, in terms of, you know, the issues going on between the U.S. and China right now, Brazil should remain absolutely agnostic and say absolutely nothing, because it can only hurt Brazil to do anything. That's been the position. Whether or not that's going to be the position that prevails, I think, is to be seen.
Can I my sense very much is that the Chinese relationship with Brazil has been largely driven by China, not by Brazil. In other words, Brazil has made very few. The Chinese decided where they're going to invest. They want to build railroads and roads and ports because that's what they need for their. They've begun to open up sort of a lot of products, low-cost products, that they punctured the Brazilian market. And I think that that's maybe a wrong word to use, isolationism. It's more the protectionism. It's hard to say isolation when Brazil has relations with, I don't know, 150 countries worldwide, has the Olympics and the World Cup the same year, leads off at the United Nations every year, et cetera. So I think probably, you know, the economic term is more right, that they've done a better job on the non-economic side in not being isolationists.
So we have a number of people who want to ask questions. I'm going to collect 4 questions, so we will have to take notes, and then I'll collect more questions afterwards. So in order, there's a question here, there's a question in the back, and there are 2 questions in the front.
Yes, my name is Nuri Rodriguez. I am from Chile, and my question is an independent woman. I saw that actually Venezuela, the inflation in Venezuela, monthly is 368% approx monthly, and the socialist president Nicolas Maduro has been, I think, very unsuccessful with his policies and all his government. Therefore, I would like your opinion, both of you. What do you think about human rights, about the poverty in Venezuela, about that the people there do not have anywhere to go for a health issue? The children are starving. Everybody is almost dying because no food there. What is your opinion? Because you mentioned that Brazilian president is supporting the new president that Chilean president support too. And also President Trump, USA president, and also another one, Colombian. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I would like your opinion. Do you think that is wrong to support?
No, I don't think any of us said that, but I'll come back.
Therefore, I would like your opinion, because you look like you are really understand very well a lot of subjects regarding policies, regarding economies. Mm-hmm. But my question is, as an independent woman, I have children, I have family. What do you think about food, about health, about human rights?
We will get to it, although this is a panel on Brazil.
Yeah, so but therefore, my panelists, do you think president from Brazil should not support that kind of issue in our country, in our continent?
Let's just move on and we'll get to your question.
Why?
I'm collecting 4 questions, so that, because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Natalia from Brazil. I'm a MIPP student here at SAIS. So I think that Roberto mentioned that he believes that Temer would do the same regarding Venezuela and the recognition of Guaido in Venezuela. not to be in the wrong side or whatever that means. My question is, what extra steps does the panel think that President Bolsonaro would take, that President Temer would not take? And what would be like kind of a successful foreign policy towards Venezuela in the opinion of the panel, please?
Thank you. Missy, right here, 2 questions.
Boa noite, eu sou Timóteo,
Boa noite.
Yankee, 30 years in the Foreign Service, but 72 to 74, consul in Porto Alegre, Rio Grande do Sul, military government. I've had 30 years of nothing but dictatorships, so I'm trying to be more progressive as I mature. I'd like to do a follow-up on the crime issue, because the answer basically was that a Rio problem and the favelas and everything. It is a serious foreign policy. I was ambassador in Paraguay and sent Alfredo Stroessner to watch Xuxa in Brasilia on TV. You have a new government, dynamic young government in Paraguay where I was ambassador, not the
Sir,
old goat.
we just need a question.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to.
And they're going to go right in the face of their big next door neighbor, because Ciudad del Este is a city that is the most corrupt, according to the OAS, the most corrupt city in the hemisphere.
So what's your
It
question
is
for
the
the
more,
panel?
it is the more corrupt city in the world, one guy said. So what, don't you think that when the other people in this world jump on the president that wanted to shoot his son, will make him instruct the people to pay attention to that awful border on crime and corruption and sin and drug
Okay.
trafficking,
Thank you.
or not?
One more.
Good evening. My name is Chris Orr. I'm a contractor with the Defense Security Service down in Quantico. However, I am not here on official DSS business, just on my personal time. My prior background is as an Air Force officer with the Department of Homeland Security, both CBP and ICE, and as an overseas private military contractor. That long preamble aside, my question also pertains to the crime problem in Brazil. As I'm sure you are all aware, one of Bolsonaro's recent proposals to help fight the crime issue was to relax a lot of the opprobrious, laws against private gun ownership in Brazil, to allow private citizens to more easily own firearms to defend themselves. Bolsonaro's policy or philosophy being that the police can only be so many places at once. And I can personally attest that gun rights advocates in this country share that same philosophy. We have the cynical joke that when seconds count, the police are just minutes away. So with that in mind, I was wondering, how do you foresee the success of Bolsonaro's proposal? Do you see his proposal for advancing private gun ownership as ultimately attaining success?
Thank you very much for making a question a question. Let me start by addressing your point, which was not a question, and it was not a question about Brazil, but let me just address it so that we're very clear on what we're saying here. None of us is defending the Maduro dictatorship. None of us. And I think, that should be vehemently clear. What all of us have said here is that there is, of course, a lot of things that we don't know how they will play out in Venezuela. And the position, this is just a statement of fact, the position that part of the Brazilian government has taken to date is to be non-interventionist. Taking that point to Natalia's question, which was about, what is a successful policy towards Venezuela, quite frankly, it's very hard to say, right? I mean, it's a country that is in the middle of a crisis that we don't know how that's going to unfold. A lot of us have been working under the assumption that what events that have recently happened will inevitably lead to Maduro being toppled. But what if that's not the case? Or at least what if that's not the case in the near future? I think all of us would like to see that be the case, but what if it's not? So I think my colleagues here may have other views, but I think at this moment, I would say that we don't really know no country really knows, especially in the region, how to deal with the Venezuelan crisis, because the Venezuelan crisis is already affecting everybody in many, many ways, including this awful humanitarian crisis that's happening with refugees across the border. So that being said, I'll let you guys take the rest.
Let me start by saying that what we're seeing here in Venezuela is the worst humanitarian crisis in recent history in Latin America. Is just, human rights violation en masse, and it's just one of the worst tragedies we've seen recently. So the impression that someone here is defending the Maduro dictatorship is just insane. But anyway, I think what I was referring to specifically regarding recognition of Guaido, and I think Natalia's questions goes to that direction, is you have several countries that recognize Guaido as the interim president based on the constitution that was approved by Chavez in 1999. It was basically, if we don't recognize Maduro's last election, which was completely, it was based on fraud, we recognize the vacancy of the presidency, therefore the president or the speaker of the Asamblea Nacional becomes the acting president. This is the starting point of a larger discussion about transition in Venezuela. If you look at academic research on transitions in Latin America, I think it's a kind of a consensus that agreed transitions work better. They produce better democracies, and they reduce the risk of civil war or political violence. The question is how you apply that to Venezuela, right? I am of the opinion that you have to bring certain parts of the regime to the negotiating table, and find some sort of solution without Maduro, without Diosdado Cabello, without people who are not only deeply involved in human rights violations, but also in crime and money laundering and so on. And try to enable a agreed transition. And I say this, I think Brazil played a very negative role in Venezuela during the PT years as an enabler of, the demolition or the gradual demolition of democracy in the neighboring country. And I'm thinking specifically about, how Brazil protected internationally Venezuela, how President Lula supported, for instance, Chavez and Maduro during elections, the chief strategies for the PT campaigns, João Santana, who's now in jail, did several campaigns for the Chavistas. So after that, my fear is that what we're seeing now from Araújo and other folks is basically saying we don't want to talk about we don't want to recognize the fact that actually Chavistas have some support in Venezuela, and there's no room for discussing. This was the position that the foreign minister took when countries met in Uruguay recently to discuss potentially starting a dialogue on Venezuela. I think it's extremely radical, and if you close all doors, you basically force the regime to become even more violent and even more, when you have, as Bob Dylan would say, when you have nothing to lose, right? And I fear that could be the outcome in Venezuela.
Thanks. Do you want to tackle the firearms question?
Yeah, so I'm going to just, I have nothing to add on the Venezuela point. I agree with what's been said. I would use that as an example of sort of the perils of ideological, using foreign policy as an ideological playground. I think that's what guided a lot of the misguided policies towards Venezuela from the previous, from the PT. But on the crime question, so first of all, I want to clarify that it's not, I wasn't describing my view in terms of the separation between crime versus, foreign policy. That's my perception of how the topic is seen in Brazil. I think, definitely there is obviously sort of a transnational component to that, but I think that's not recognized in the policy debate very much. It's like a very, it's not a prominent link. So I was basically kind of describing that as I see. Now on the issue of guns, I think it's another issue where it's coming from an ideological attachment to a policy solution and not coming from an evidence-based approach. I think the evidence suggests that it's not going to work, and I agree with General Mourão, actually, who said, look, this is not a policy to fight crime. This is just to, fulfill a campaign promise, and that's it. I think that is what it is, and that's unfortunate because I think policy should be guided by evidence and not by ideology.
Yeah,
Let me just make one point
Please,
on
please do.
Venezuela, if I can. Excuse me. That I think you're right that part of the PT policy was rather deplorable. But the distinction between the PT policy and Fernando Enrique Cardoso, for example, when you had the FARC in Colombia, where they did nothing. When you come to that Brazil now with Bolsonaro, Brazil isn't doing a whole lot with regard to Venezuela. It's just sort of raising its hand and saying yes when all the other Latin American countries are saying yes. It's not taking any. The fact is that Lula did keep Brazil out of the ALBA, didn't put it in. It didn't allow for the television network to go forward. In many respects, that Brazil was doing exactly what you said, was sort of keeping the lines open. And unfortunately, Lula did come out in support. I think that was a mistake and all. But I don't think that the distinction between Brazil and some of the more conservative governments was all that different during the period of the Chavez regime.
Yeah, I think, well, we differ on that, for sure. And I think what you're referring to is basically, at a time when the Venezuelan economy was booming, we had the Abreu y Lima refinery, and at the beginning, actually, there was some sort of rivalry between Chavez and Lula, and the Bush administration thought that Lula was great because he would represent the responsible left. I think this was at the early stage, right? The 2005, 2006. What we've seen later on, when it was clear that the Chavistas were not there for democracies, that elections were being rigged, was a different approach. And I think if you look at, you're right that it's.
But no other Latin American country did anything either.
Well, but
So in other words, that's the way Latin America responds to these kinds of issues.
Okay. I see Monica just going like this. Let me just say.
Okay.
Well, but I don't recall, the chief marketing strategist of the Kirchners going to Venezuela. I don't recall the road that, Odebrecht doing what, the metro, the subway in Caracas, or JBS having a quasi-monopoly on meat distribution in Venezuela because they had all the connections in Caracas, right? I think that there was some distinction there. It was not like, Brazil was acting like Chile or, Colombia. But that's, again.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap up. I know that there are many questions in the room, and I didn't do justice to this side of the room. There were a lot of hands raised here. I apologize. We ran out of time. But here's the silver lining. We have been putting together with the dialogue these events on Brazil, and we will continue to do so. As you can see, it is ripe for discussion. There's discussion amongst the panelists, which is not something that you usually see in DC. The panelists do not agree with each other, and we make a point of not agreeing with each other in order to make the discussion more lively. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for coming. I would like to apologize to those of you who didn't get to ask a question, but I would like to also extend to you an invitation to come to our future Brazil events because we will do more. Right, Peter?
Right.
So there will be many more instances with that. Thank you.